Welcome to this presentation of the Rotary Club of North Bethesda, Maryland, USA. Our club was established in 1974. We meet every Friday morning at 7:45 a.m., and we often invite guest speakers to give presentations on all kinds of interesting subjects. Please contact us through our website at nbrotary.org. And thanks for watching. Our speaker today is Bob Sonawane. Dr. Sonawane worked as a toxicologist with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and at the National Center for Environmental Assessment of the U.S. EPA. Dr. Sonawane has over 35 years of research and management experience in toxicology and pharmacology. He's also a member of the North Bethesda Rotary Club. And his talk today is about the problem of electronic waste, or EWaste.
So what I want to talk about, one of the emerging issues around the world, the environmental pollution, is electronic waste. You can call it electronic junk, and it is one of the biggest challenges that we'll be facing in the near future. We're already facing it, but it is an increasing challenge about the electronic waste. So what I'm going to briefly talk about the electronic waste, the kind of chemicals that you see in electronic waste, how it is a global problem, and how the risk assessment, that is the assessing the health risk as well as environmental risk, is a challenge. What is an electronic waste? E-waste is a term used to cover items of all types of electrical and electronic equipment and its parts that have been discarded by the owner as a waste without the intention of reuse. That is the classic definition. There are several definitions, but this is one of the World Health Organization's adopted definition around the electronic waste. This is the huge problem in the African continent. I'll come back to that, how electronic waste has become a problem for Africa and many other developing countries. And this is to do with the commerce. These are some of the scary pictures that you will see here about how the electronic waste being recycled in the third world countries, mostly in Africa, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and some in China. China recently stopped it. But this is the kind of scene that you see, and I have seen myself this in India. One of my relatives who owns a business of electronic recycling, and I've seen this kind of a problem existing in a lot of countries, specifically in developing world. So the electronics are becoming more and more part of everyday life. People are connected through and to technology in a ways we have never seen before in recent years. And the systems is embedded with, when you say electronic waste, we are seeing all kind of electronics, microwaves, printers, key fobs, remotes, cars. Of course, the cars are loaded with all kind of computerized stuff, appliances, cell phones, smart devices. A smart computing era has increased the electrical kettles. In kitchen, you'll see everything electrical nowadays in the Western countries, at least. Smart mugs, smart mattresses, pillows, smart watches, smart bicycles, fitness trackers, on and on. This thing is unbelievably long list of all kinds of electronic gadgets that we use in everyday life. There was a scientist, and as well as a philosophical, he looked at the whole thing. Moore's law, he was a scientist at IBM a number of years back. And Moore's basically describes that the technology and the social change has basically described as a driving force the economic growth all around the world at the global level. The economic impact of this, as computing power increased, energy efficiency improved, this development not only enhanced industries, increased productivity, but empowered cheap and powerful computing. The societal impact of this electronic industry is because electronic industry is becoming inexpensive, ubiquitous, computing rapidly expanding all around us, is fundamentally changing the way we work, play, and communicate with each other. The foundational force of Moore's law has driven breakthroughs in modern cities, transportation, healthcare, education, energy production, and you can name any industry or categories of industry, how the electronics, including artificial intelligence and so on, how electronic industry is changing. There's a whole association in this town called Semiconductors Association. And if you go to their website, the Semiconductors International Association of Semiconductor Industry, they talk about nothing but the exponential growth in all kinds of electronics at the global level, more so in the developing world nowadays, is kind of unbelievable growth. You'll see how the predictions are on the semiconductor industry in general. As you know, the average lifespan of electronics, and this may be changing very fast also, the cell phones, basically the lifespan average now about 1.5 years, and they're about 130. This is about 2 or 3 years old data. So the lifespan, we retire about 130 million cell phones around the world. Just basically we discard them. And millions, 500 millions are stockpiled. The computers and laptops, as we know it, we all change it like every other year or within a year or two. And about 25 million retired per year. And about 240 million are already stockpiled. For every new cell phone or a computer, one becomes obsolete. As we get the new one, the other becomes obsolete. So where does it go? So as the saying goes, today's gadgets are tomorrow's West. And these kind of piles I've seen, at least I've seen one in India in one of the industries there. And this is true all over the world, specifically in the developing world. And I'll tell you why developing world. Because we all export this. Global electronic waste is produced in staggering quantities, estimated to be about 70 million tons in 2017. What is an electronic waste? So you're talking about electronics scrap components such as CPUs contain potentially harmful components, such as epoxy resins, fiberglass, PCBs, which is polychlorinated biphenyls, PVCs, polyvinyl chlorides, and thermostatic plastics, and all kinds of metals. Lead is, of course, one of them. Tin, copper, silicon, beryllium, carbon, iron, mercury, chromium, aluminum. This is just a partial list. So if you look at the table of elements, you will see practically every metal is used in the electronic industry. And so that becomes a problem because most of these are known. I'll come back to the next few slides, are known human carcinogens or all kinds of adverse health effects. So here is the detailed composition of electronic waste. This is not really detailed, it's kind of overview here. We have brominated flame retardants or fire retardants for electronic equipment. We have PCBs, I mentioned earlier, which is one of the most dangerous chemicals and persistent chemicals like dioxins and PCBs. And they last forever. They just don't disappear. So here, what you see in table here, on one side, on the left-hand side, you see the classes of chemicals, and other side, you see where this is coming from. So I won't go into the details. Basically, as I was mentioning earlier, we have heavy metals, which are dangerous. And I think Bruce can speak more about the heavy metals than anybody in the world, because he has written volumes in this book as he talked about the lead problem last week. And so these are the kind of things that you see coming out of this electronic waste. Here is the problem. The global e-waste production has tremendously increased. For example, this is again a little older information. In the European continent, about 9 million tons. In the US, about 2.5 million tons. And where does this go? This goes to the developing world. And 85%, you won't believe it, 85% of the waste that we create in the Western world, mostly in the United States, North America, and also in Europe, end up in African continent or the Asian continent. And this is scary because we don't recycle it very well. Only 15 to 20% of the electronic waste in the Western world is really recycled. And because it is expensive to recycle, and I'll come back to the problem later. You're talking about, this is the 2014 data, but you're talking about millions and millions of dollars of business here, which is recycling of electronic waste. And why recycling? Because you're looking at all electronic waste as all precious metals, like platinum and gold and silver, and some of the rare earth elements that you will see in the electronic waste, and palladium, as I mentioned. Several of these kind of compounds are actually extracted from, literally extracted from, by hammering out some of these gadgets and taking it out and further recycle. This is where it goes. Most of the electronic waste goes to, as I mentioned, South Asia, East Asia, African continent, and Middle Eastern countries. And it goes, as I mentioned earlier, from the Western countries, from North America, and it ends up in, like you see the red dots there, that is where the electronic waste is being generated, and now it is being sent to the countries which you see the blue dots. This is where actually is ending up the electronic waste, because it's damn cheap to sell this thing instead of recycling in our own countries. Here we send it to the developing world, and for them it's economic boom in certain parts of some of these countries. As I mentioned, according to US EPA, only estimated 15% of the global e-waste is fully recycled. Base metals such as copper, special metals such as cobalt, and precious metals as gold are desirable for recycling. Precious and special metals such as platinum, indium, ruthenium are extracted and reused because they're pretty expensive. As you know, the platinum is more expensive than the gold. And so these metals and rare earth elements, which I didn't mention, all kinds of rare earth elements, which is, it's a short supply. The major producer of rare earth elements is China. So recycling practices in many of these low and middle income countries are handling and disposal of discarded e-waste is frequently unregulated. They have the laws. I've studied the laws in different countries, and basically they have the laws. Implementation is very poor. The systems are very corrupt, the political as well as the implementing regulatory systems are very corrupt, or the organizations are very corrupt. And so anything goes in that part of the world or where this thing is being recycled. So what is the solution? A lot of this thing is burned. Actually, it's open pits. So when they collect this electronic waste, very cheap, sometimes free. And I give one example, the city in Pune, where I come originally from. I was sitting and my relative was trying to get the started business in 2016. He said, "Uncle, I cannot get it. We have a connection with the corporation, Pune Corporation." So I called one of my friends, and he called the mayor and he said, "Okay, you can have it free. We collect this, and you can have it free." So what this guy did is basically using the connections, got the electronic waste and started a huge business where it's actually the stuff is collected, the metals are taken out, and the damn thing is, the rest of the thing is burned. Like I said, a huge pile, like as high as a two-story building. So there are no safeguards. And who works on this kind of burning and taking out this metals is poor people. Basically less than $2 a day they're making and taking out these metals from them. And then the rest of the thing, what this guy does is sends to South India in a city called Madras. And from there, you go to Singapore, and then they further process and take out a lot of other stuff, plastics and other metals and so on. It's a very, very, very well-organized business all around that part of the world, and mostly in the developing countries. So this has become a huge threat, because when you are burning the burning site, okay, is a huge problem, and it goes in the water systems. It goes the surface water and the groundwater, and causes all kinds of health issues with this the people who are actually conducting this recycling business. So dismantling at the end of life electronics to retrieve valuable elements with the primitive techniques, mostly burning, as I mentioned, often used because of lacks of import-export trade laws, environmental regulations, and the cheap labor. That is the major attraction for these people to recycle and make money out of it. So the recycling practices, I just want to give you some examples of Ghana, China, Thailand, Philippines, India, and Vietnam. These are large open sites with several smaller operations. And so basically the second column here, the different practices, but basically what it really comes down to is really a small scale industry is popping up all over that part of the world, including Africa. And as I mentioned, is basically open burning, acid baths, and taking out some of these metals, and the manual dismantling of some of the electronic waste, basically taking out the precious metals. And you talk again, these are the kind of observed health outcomes, and these are the studies which have been done: respiratory tract infections, renal problems, that's the kidney problems, dizziness, thyroid dysfunction, lung function, sensory integration, muscular dystrophy, limited research on health outcomes, respiratory disorders, limited research on health outcomes. Surprisingly, about 2 years back, I organized a symposium, also the same meeting I was mentioning earlier, and Bruce was a part of that. And Bruce has written a book, only book available on electronic waste and its health effects, is published by our own member here, Dr. Bruce Fowler. So I borrowed a lot of stuff from his book, and of course, then additional information that I could get it from the literature. So huge health problem, health effects in the population which is recycling. I'm not talking general population. The people who are working, mostly the young ladies and the children. I mean, when they're not supposed to do this kind of work, that is actually happening in that part of the world because of the economic situations. As I mentioned, it's the one thing, what is the electronic waste, and what happens after burning. After burning, you are creating more dangerous chemicals. As some of you know or don't know, dioxins, which is the compounds which are used in one of the pesticides that we use in the Vietnam War, 2,4,5-T, to clear the vegetation. And after the 2,4,5-T or any burning creates one of the most dangerous chemicals, the most toxic chemical in the world is the dioxins. Of course, so the dioxins, the perinatal flame retardants, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the polycyclic, the PCBs, chlorinated biphenyls. These are what we call in the scientific context, it's called PBTs, persistent biotoxic agents. They are never go out of the system, and they basically bioaccumulate over a period of time, very long years of half-life. They don't die. It's like radioactive material. Generally about 7 to 8 years half-life on a lot of these compounds they're looking at. And the exposure routes through the inhalation, that is through the respiration, ingestion when we eat the food, or use the crops which are grown around that area, transplacental during the pregnancy, and dermal contact. All kinds of exposures occur in these population who are exposed to this. Again, I won't go into the details because I already mentioned to you, these are the major compounds: lead, mercury, cadmium, PCBs, brominated flame retardants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and dioxins. And I already mentioned the health effects. So this is much more detailed than what I just said earlier. And you're talking kilotons, not just few pounds here or there, aluminum, gold, silver. And you heard some of this. I think one of the things which is never realized, the plastics, because all these gadgets are plastics. And that's another problem that we see with the plastics. You'll be hearing next time about the microplastics. So I already mentioned to you, there are many routes and many sources of exposure: air, water, soil, food, and both acute effects and chronic effects. Acute being immediate effects, and the chronic being a long-term effect that you see with these chemicals that we are exposed to. And the effects could be inhibitory. That means the compounds, when they are causing these effects, could be inhibiting each other's effects, or could be synergistic or additive effects. Most of them are really the synergistic and additive effect you see of this chemical in terms of health effects. So one of the major problems, as I mentioned to you earlier, the physiological vulnerability. Who are more exposed to? Mostly the vulnerable population, that is pregnant women and children in general, because those are the kind of people who work in these recycling businesses, are the young ladies who are in the reproductive age also working in this population has a huge problem about this. They are more vulnerable compared to the general adult population. This is the same figure. You're talking about the whole ecosystem being contaminated with electronic waste, okay? So as you can see from these different arrows, that you see basically everything is being exposed, both the environment in general through uptake of the aquatic systems, as well as in anywhere in the family, and including our domestic animals. Everything is being exposed. And this, again, by accumulation of these chemical substances. I'm talking, it's a very serious problem, by accumulation. That means they don't go away. They last forever. And they keep on accumulating as a chain of events occur, as they occur over a period of time. So it may start at one place, but then you are getting exposed to both flora, fauna, that is the animals and the organisms and so on, all kinds of plants and crops and soil, everything is being contaminated by electronic waste in that particular community where the recycling is occurring. So what are we doing with this? IARC, which I just want to say, IARC is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, located in Lyon, France, which is a part of the WHO, World Health Organization, has identified this compound are carcinogenic to humans. TCDD, that is the dioxins, basically, cadmium, hexavalent chromium, beryllium, all these metals, quite a few of them are carcinogenic to humans. Or they could be carcinogenic, likely to be carcinogenic to humans. There are different classes of carcinogenicity, or there could be animal carcinogens and so on. So they're also genotoxicants. That means they cause damage to our genes or genetic damage, and genetic damage further leads to carcinogenesis. They're also cytotoxicants. Cytotoxicants means they're causes the cell damage of the human cell damage, or any organism cell are being damaged. Toxicants means causes toxicity. And again, as I mentioned several times now, the dioxins and the perfluoroalkyl compounds are called PFAS and PFOS. These are persistent chemicals, and at world level, at the WHO level, a lot of work is being done to reduce the exposure to these chemicals, but it is very difficult. And they are known to cause, and I'm not talking about just animal studies, I'm talking about the human data, epidemiological data, chronic diseases later in life. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. Again, exposure, the dose makes the poison. That doesn't mean anything that you're exposed to cause all these effects I'm mentioning it. It's the concentrated or the dose levels that the people are exposed to in certain communities where these operations occur, that's what it causes these kind of effects. And that's where the studies are done. Lung function, lung damage, you name it. It's practically some of the most dangerous metals and dangerous chemicals I just mentioned to you are causing health risk because the e-waste in certain parts of the world, in certain communities where this is being recycled. Perinatal and neonatal outcomes means the effects in pregnancy, and neonatal means during the early growth period in the newborns and the toddlers and so on. That's the neonatal period. Causes fetal growth, low birth weight, birth length, low head circumference, stillbirths, preterm delivery. You name it, all kinds of developmental effects you see because of the chemicals which I just mentioned to you. And these are based on the studies. I'm not making it up here just because it sounds easier to say that. It is not. This is actual data from the epidemiological data, human data that has been collected, human studies that have been collected in certain populations where these things are occurring. Lead, I think Bruce talked about it, and I've done some studies on lead in puberty in girls, both in monkeys. Bruce and I did some studies in Wisconsin, as I mentioned last time, as well as I did some studies in India looking at the puberty in girls and in boys, how this may affect. Lead is a pretty well-known and very dangerous chemical which can cause delayed puberty in girls. And so what I'm getting at here, endocrine disruptors, which causes all hormonal balances are being disturbed by some of these chemicals, organic pollutants. And these are based on the studies that we know of about in certain locations because of the electronic waste. As I mentioned to you, children are more vulnerable because of the behavior, hand-to-mouth behavior. Younger children have tendency to put everything in their mouth. And so a lot of these chemicals are, of course, are ended up in children as a burden, heavy, as additional burden, then they're already exposed to some other thing. These chemicals are also exposed to the breast milk. And as you know it, in a lot of developing world, breast milk is the mother's milk that the kids have, and not what we say, the formula that we use in a lot of the Western world. So keep that in mind. And all kind of systems, developing systems are being affected by these chemicals I just mentioned to you. I think I am not going to go into this, but these are the kinds of this, some of the effects people have studied. Whether it's a lead exposure, I think was mentioned last time, as well as in aggression, violent crime, and prisoners. But again, these are some of the studies which people are exploring, are planning, are doing some of the studies to study the effects of electronic waste in certain localities, certain population where the exposure is very high. So keep that in mind. These are very dangerous chemicals. And I just want to mention the WHO, World Health Organization, which is located in Geneva. I was about a couple of months was an advisor to the WHO a number of years back. NIH's, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is a part of NIH, which is in the Research Triangle part of North Carolina, they are having a whole collaboration across the world on the research in this area, and the funding also from the United States and other Western countries to study the effects of electronic waste, okay? I'm going to stop here because I think I can continue this more detail, but there is a lot of activity around the world, and at least in two of them I was involved. That's the Basel Convention, the Bangkok Statement. I was involved, with several of the pediatricians around the world that we had a meeting, and we said, we need to deal with these issues. But again, those are kind of declarations, scientific recommendations, declarations. So there's a lot of activities going around the international level every few years that the scientific, expertise meet and declare. But in terms of implementation is on the individual countries. There is no international agreement saying we need to implement this from a regulatory point of view. Depends upon each country regulating their own e-waste problems. So I was involved in two of them, as I mentioned to you, the Bangkok Convention, Bangkok, as well as the Pacific Basin Consortium in 2013. So I think there's a lot of literature, a lot of publications from the workshops or the meeting that has been held around the world for several years, and that continues to do so still. I won't go into the details because this is more of more scientific than you probably would like to know. They can cause, as I mentioned to you, all kinds of health effects. And what we need epidemiological studies, longitudinal studies, is forward-looking studies to study the adverse health effects. This is not a single chemical exposure. You're talking multiple chemicals that you are being exposed to. And as I mentioned, too, could be synergistic or additive effects. And we don't know the dose response. We don't know the exposure information very well. And therefore, we cannot do a better assessment of these chemicals. No, I won't go into this. Okay, I will stop here because there are a lot of publications, for example, phthalates, which are also causes all kinds of endocrine effects. And there are a lot of documents have been published, the approaches have been published by both by EPA and National Research Council here in town, or National Academy of Sciences dealing with these kind of issues. No, this is more scientific. So to conclude, we have a lot of research gaps here. Long-term adverse health effects of e-waste are not, we're still studying it. We really don't know what the long-term adverse health effects are. There are several data gaps that research needs in studying physical health, mental health, education, behavioral outcomes, and on and on. As I said, I just gave only a couple of references here, including the one. So in short, e-waste is an evolving global environmental problem. E-waste recycling in developing countries is likely to grow in the future. Electronic waste exposure causes various human health effects, especially in animals and susceptible vulnerable population like children and pregnant women. And health environmental risk assessment of e-waste chemical mixtures is a challenge. And I'll stop here. And there are several major references here. And thanks to Dr. Bruce Fowler for his book.
I had a question.
Sure.
Well, is there a safe way to recycle e-waste?
Safe way, as you see some of these, some of the shops here, like for example, Best Buy, not Best Buy, yeah. They say, well, they can take it back, some of the old, gadgets, and either they give you money or they just take it away from you. But then they collect this. Several of these electronic industry, they collect this, or the stores collect this, junk, but they send it to, as I said, because it's very expensive to recycle in this country. And then they send it to the rest of the world. Bruce, you want to say anything?
Well, Bob, this is excellent. I think you've given a wonderful overview. The 2 points I would add into this are that we're dealing with a full spectrum effects. Okay, so Bob has touched on the women of childbearing age and the children. These chemicals work against all of us, even senior citizens. And so that we are, in effect, part of the vulnerable population. That's one thing. The other thing, just a statistic, which is a little old right now. The reason for people doing recycling is these devices. One of them, particularly the cell phones and the computers, is gold. There is more gold in 1 ton of e-waste than in 17 tons of gold ore.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot to mention.
This is as I'm sure a number of you have appreciated, finance is driving this, okay? But from the point of view of people in developing countries where they have very very low standards of living. This literally, this is a gold mine. And so they're going to take the risk of open pit burning, as Bob showed you, and what they're doing is burning the insulation off the wiring so they can get to the metals inside, copper, metal, gold, and some of these other metals. So it isn't going away anytime soon, say it that way. And so what can be done? Well, basically you can do safe recycling, but it costs more money. And it's the adage of, it's going to cost us money. So they don't want to do it because it hurts their bottom line.
No.
But this is, as Bob has very nicely outlined for you on this overview, this is big. It's global. And all of us are exposed because these chemicals get thrown up into the atmosphere and the jet stream, and it goes everywhere. And so I think we're going to have to make some decisions. I mean, the good news is that the WHO and these other international health agencies are on this, but they have relatively little power. All they can do is advise. And so there's going to have to be some political decisions made about this. And that is happening, I guess. But
I think the only thing I was disappointed with the electronic industry here. When I organized a symposium about 2 years back, Bruce, you were part of it. And I approached the Apple, IBM, what's the other one? About 3 or 4 major companies. And I said, well, can you send at least some observers to our presentations? Mm-hmm. The answer was no. We don't want to come to this meeting because they thought they will be attacked by the scientists. And so they basically denied to attend even the meeting. It was very strange to me when they had an interest in at least learning about this. I approached even the Semiconductor Industry Association here. They said, and if you go to their website, they don't talk about the health effects. They only talk about the growth of the industry. It's all market-driven phenomenon here, which is kind of very scary to me as we look at the future.